The telegram arrived at Muhammad Ali's training camp in Miami at 3:17 a.m. on March 5, 1971. 3 days before the most anticipated boxing match in history. Ali was scheduled to fight Joe Frazier at Madison Square Garden to undefeated heavyweights. The undisputed championship of the world on the line, 20,000 screaming fans. And the largest television audience in boxing history. The telegram contained only 7 words. The children of Vietnam need you to lose. B.J. Ali stared at the message for a long time, his hands trembling slightly. He knew exactly who B.J. was. And he knew that Bumpy Johnson didn't send telegrams unless someone's life depended on the message. In 72 hours, Muhammad Ali would enter the ring against Joe Frazier as the betting favorite. The people's champion, the man who had sacrificed everything for his principles. But what the world didn't know, what the 20,000 fans in Madison Square Garden and the 300 million people watching on television would never suspect was that the greatest boxer in history had just agreed to lose. The most important fight of his career. Not for money, not for fear, but for something more important than championships, the lives of children on the other side of the world. To understand how Bumpy Johnson convinced Muhammad Ali to throw the fight of the century, you have to understand the war that was, destroying both men's communities and the desperate plan that brought them together in the most unlikely alliance in sports history. By March 1971, the Vietnam War had been raging for over 6 years, and it was killing young black men at a rate that horrified anyone who understood the statistics. While black Americans made up only 11% of the U.S. population, they represented 20% of combat deaths in Vietnam. Boys from Harlem, from Detroit, from Chicago's South Side were being drafted at twice the rate of their white counterparts, sent to fight a war that many didn't understand, for a country that didn't treat them as equal citizens. Muhammad Ali had become the most visible opponent of this injustice. In 1967, he had refused induction into the U.S. Army, famously declaring, "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong." No Viet Cong ever called me N. The decision cost him everything, his heavyweight title, his boxing license, 3.5 years of his athletic prime, and millions of dollars in lost earnings. But Ali's stand had also made him something more powerful than a champion. It made him a symbol of resistance. Bumpy Johnson had watched Ali's sacrifice with deep respect. Unlike many in the black community who initially criticized Ali for refusing to serve his country, Bumpy understood that Ali was fighting a different kind of battle, one that protected young black men who had no choice about going to war. But by 1971, both men faced the same terrible reality. Their symbolic victories weren't saving lives. Black boys were still dying in Vietnamese jungles at devastating rates, and the anti-war movement was losing momentum as Americans grew tired of protests and demonstrations. That's when Bumpy Johnson conceived a plan so audacious, so morally complex, that it would require the greatest athlete in the world to sacrifice his legacy for the possibility of saving thousands of lives. The plan began with a secret that the U.S. government had been hiding from the American people for 2 years. In 1969, President Richard Nixon had authorized a classified military operation called Project Phoenix a systematic assassination program targeting Vietnamese civilians suspected of supporting the North Vietnamese Army. The program was run by the CIA and involved the torture and murder of over 20,000 Vietnamese civilians, many of them children. The existence of Project Phoenix was known only to a small group of military officials, CIA operatives, and government contractors. But one of those contractors was a company owned by Madison Square Garden primary investors, a company that had been providing logistical support for CIA operations in Southeast Asia since 1967. Bumpy Johnson had learned about Project Phoenix through his network of contacts in New York's business community. More importantly, he had obtained classified documents proving that American tax dollars were funding the systematic murder of Vietnamese children. Documents that would destroy the Nixon administration if they became public. But Bumpy knew that simply releasing the documents wouldn't be enough. Government scandals came and went, but public attention was fleeting. To truly impact American policy in Vietnam, he needed to create a moment of national focus that would force millions of Americans to confront the reality of what their government was doing. The fight of the century provided that moment. On March 8, 1971, Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier were scheduled to face each other in the most anticipated sporting event in American history. The fight had captured the imagination of the world not just because both men were undefeated, but because they represented different philosophies about black identity and American patriotism. Ali was the rebellious champion, the man who had sacrificed everything for his principles, the voice of black pride and anti-war resistance. Frazier was the hard-working challenger, the son of a sharecropper who had risen through dedication and discipline, the man who still believed in the American dream. The symbolic weight of their confrontation meant that 300 million people would be watching, the largest television audience in boxing history. And Bumpy Johnson realized that this unprecedented level of attention could be used to expose Project Phoenix and save Vietnamese children from American-funded assassination programs. But the plan required Muhammad Ali's cooperation, and it required Ali to make the greatest sacrifice of his career. On March 5, 1971, Bumpy Johnson flew from New York to Miami to meet with Ali at his training camp. The meeting was arranged through Ali's spiritual advisor, a man who had worked with Bumpy to provide financial support for families of young black men killed in Vietnam. "Champ," Bumpy said when they met privately in Ali's hotel room, "I need to ask you to do something that's going to hurt more than any punch Joe Frazier could ever throw." Ali listened as Bumpy explained Project Phoenix, showing him classified documents that detailed the CIA's systematic murder of Vietnamese civilians. The photographs were devastating children who had been tortured and killed by American operatives, families destroyed by a program that the American people didn't even know existed. "My God," Ali whispered, staring at pictures of children who looked barely older than his own daughters. "They're killing babies. They're actually killing babies. 20,000 Vietnamese civilians so far," Bumpy said quietly. "Most of them women and children. And it's being funded by American tax dollars, authorized by American officials, carried out by American operatives." Ali was silent for a long time, studying the documents and photographs. Finally, he looked up at Bumpy. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to lose to Joe Frazier." Ali stared at him in disbelief. "What?" "I want you to lose the fight, and I want you to lose it in a way that creates maximum attention and controversy. I want the whole world focused on what happens at Madison Square Garden on March 8th. But why? How does me losing help these children?" Bumpy pulled out a detailed plan that he had been developing for months. The strategy was complex, but the basic concept was simple. Use the massive attention generated by Ali S.'s shocking loss to expose Project Phoenix to the American people. "The fight is being held at Madison Square Garden," Bumpy explained. "The garden is owned by investors who are also major contractors for CIA operations in Vietnam. During the fight, when 300 million people are watching, I am going to release classified documents proving that the same people who are profiting from your fight are also profiting from the murder of Vietnamese children. But I still don't understand why I need to lose, because if you win, the story becomes about your victory. The headlines will be about your comeback, your triumph, your vindication. But if you lose, especially if you lose in a controversial way, the attention stays focused on the fight itself. On Madison Square Garden, on the people who organized and profited from the event." Ali was quiet for several minutes, processing the moral complexity of what Bumpy was asking. "You want me to sacrifice my championship, my legacy, everything I've worked for, to expose this Phoenix thing. I want you to sacrifice one fight to save thousands of lives. The children in those photographs, they're dying right now while we're talking. Every day that Project Phoenix continues, more families are destroyed. Your loss could be the moment that forces America to confront what we're doing in Vietnam, and you're sure this plan will work. I'm sure it's our best chance. Your fight with Frazier is the most watched sporting event in history. If we can use that attention to expose Project Phoenix, we can create the kind of public outrage that forces the government to shut down the program." Ali walked to the window of his hotel room, looking out at the ocean. He thought about his own children, about the Vietnamese children in the photographs, about the young black men from his neighborhood who had died in Vietnamese jungles. "If I lose this fight," Ali said slowly, "people will think I'm finished. They'll say I was never as good as I claimed to be. They'll say the 3 years away from boxing destroyed me. Your legacy isn't one fight. Champ, your legacy is standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. You did it when you refused to go to Vietnam. Now I'm asking you to do it again." Ali turned back to Bumpy. "How do I know you'll actually release those documents? How do I know this isn't just about gambling, money, or some other scheme?" Bumpy had anticipated this question. From his briefcase, he pulled out a letter addressed to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CBS News. The letter contained details about Project Phoenix and promised the delivery of classified documents immediately following the Ali Frazier fight. "These letters are being held by a law firm in Washington," Bumpy said. "They have instructions to deliver them to the news organizations at midnight on March 8th, regardless of what happens to me. The story will break whether I'm alive, dead, or in jail." Ali read the letters carefully. They were detailed, specific, and clearly written, by someone who understood both the political implications of exposing Project Phoenix and the moral necessity of stopping it. "One more question," Ali said. "Why me? Why not expose this some other way?" "Because you're Muhammad Ali. When you speak, the world listens. When you sacrifice, people understand that something important is at stake. Your loss won't just be about boxing, it'll be about principles, about the cost of standing up for what's right." That night, Ali called his wife Belinda and his spiritual advisors. He showed them the classified documents about Project Phoenix, explained Bumpy's plan, and asked for their guidance. The conversation lasted until dawn. By the time the sun rose over Miami Beach, Muhammad Ali had made the most difficult decision of his career. He would lose the fight of the century to help expose the systematic murder of Vietnamese children. But losing to Joe Frazier wasn't just about taking a fall or throwing punches softly. To make the plan work, Ali had to lose in a way that appeared legitimate while still maintaining his dignity and his principles. Over the next 3 days, Ali developed a strategy that would allow him to lose while still fighting with honor. He would fight aggressively for the first 10 rounds, establishing that he was in peak physical condition and capable of winning. Then, in the later rounds, he would take calculated risks that would leave him vulnerable to Frazier's powerful left hook. The key was making the loss look like the result of tactical mistakes rather than lack of effort or ability. Ali would have to absorb real punishment, take genuine hits, and accept a defeat that would damage his reputation while serving a greater cause. On March 8, 1971, Muhammad Ali entered Madison Square Garden as a 6-5 betting favorite. The atmosphere was electric. 20,000 fans packed into the arena. Celebrities filled the ringside seats, and an estimated 300 million people around the world were watching on television. What none of them knew was that they were about to witness the most morally complex performance in sports history. A great champion choosing to lose in order to save lives. For the first 10 rounds, Ali fought brilliantly. He used his speed and skill to frustrate Frazier, landing crisp combinations and avoiding the challenger's powerful left hook. By the end of the 10th round, Ali was ahead on 2 of the 3 scorecards, and it appeared that he was on his way to reclaiming his championship. But in the 11th round, Ali began implementing his strategy of controlled vulnerability. He started standing in the pocket longer than necessary, giving Frazier opportunities to land his devastating left hook. He threw more aggressive combinations that left him momentarily off balance and exposed. The shift was subtle. Most observers attributed it to fatigue or overconfidence. But Frazier, who had been waiting for such openings, began to capitalize on Ali's tactical mistakes. In the 15th and final round, Ali created the opportunity that would seal his defeat. Instead of using his mobility to stay away from Frazier's dangerous left hand, Ali planted his feet and tried to trade punches with the harder-hitting challenger. Frazier's left hook caught Ali flush on the jaw, sending him crashing to the canvas. Ali rose at the count of 4, but he was clearly hurt, his legs unsteady. His usual fluid movement replaced by the awkward stumbling of a fighter who had absorbed tremendous punishment. Frazier won a unanimous decision, and Muhammad Ali had suffered the first loss of his professional career. As Ali sat on his stool after the fight, Blood streaming from cuts around his eyes, he whispered to his corner man, "Did we do enough?" The corner man, who was one of the few people who knew about Bumpy's plan, nodded slightly. The whole world was watching. Champ, the whole world was watching. At exactly midnight on March 8, 1971, 4 hours after Ali's defeat, classified documents detailing Project Phoenix were delivered to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CBS News by morning. The story was front-page news across America. The headlines were devastating. CIA death squads murder Vietnamese children. Secret assassination program funded by U.S. taxpayers. Madison Square Garden investors. Profit from Vietnamese genocide. The connection between the Ollie Frazier fight and Project Phoenix was explosive. The same investors who had profited from the biggest fight in boxing history were also profiting from the systematic murder of Vietnamese civilians. The moral contradiction was impossible to ignore. Americans had paid to watch two men fight, while their tax dollars funded the killing of children. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Anti-war protests erupted in major cities across the country. Congressional hearings were demanded. Religious leaders condemned the government's hypocrisy. The Ollie Frazier fight became a symbol of American moral contradictions, the celebration of violence as entertainment, while real violence destroyed innocent lives overseas. Within 6 weeks, Project Phoenix was officially terminated. The CIA assassination program that had killed over 20,000 Vietnamese civilians was shut down, and several officials involved in the program were prosecuted for war crimes. More importantly, the exposure of Project Phoenix accelerated America's withdrawal from Vietnam. Public support for the war, already declining, collapsed entirely when Americans learned that their government was systematically murdering civilians. By 1973, all American combat forces had been withdrawn from Vietnam. Muhammad Ali never publicly acknowledged his role in exposing Project Phoenix. When asked about his loss to Frazier, he would simply say, "Sometimes you have to lose a battle to win a war," but people close to Ali knew that March 8, 1971, represented the greatest victory of his career, not despite losing the fight, but because of it. In 1974, Ali regained his heavyweight championship by defeating George Foreman in Zaire. He went on to become a 3-time heavyweight champion and was eventually recognized as the greatest boxer of all time. But Ali always considered his loss to Joe Frazier to be his most important fight, not because of what happened in the ring, but because of what happened as a result of his willingness to sacrifice personal glory for a greater cause. Joe Frazier never learned the full truth about why Ali seemed to make uncharacteristic tactical mistakes in their fight. But years later, when they had both retired and their relationship had softened, Frazier said something that suggested he suspected Ali had fought for reasons that went beyond boxing. Ali was a different kind of champion, Frazier said in a 1990 interview. He understood that being great meant more than just winning fights. Sometimes it meant knowing when to lose. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, 3 years before the Ali Frazier fight. But his organization continued to operate under the leadership of men who shared his commitment to using power and influence to protect innocent lives. The plan to use Ali's defeat to expose Project Phoenix had actually been conceived by Bumpy in 1967, shortly before his death. He had spent months developing the strategy, obtaining the classified documents, and building the network of contacts that would make the plan possible. Bumpy never lived to see his plan implemented, but his legacy lived on in the men who carried out his final mission, saving Vietnamese children by convincing the greatest boxer in history to sacrifice his championship for a greater cause. On March 8, 1971, 300 million people watched Muhammad Ali lose the fight of the century. What they didn't see was the victory that resulted from that lost the termination of a secret assassination program, the acceleration of America's withdrawal from Vietnam, and the salvation of thousands of innocent lives. The greatest fight in boxing history wasn't won by the man who remained standing at the end. It was won by the man who chose to fall knowing that his sacrifice would lift up children he would never meet in a country he would never visit, who needed someone with the courage to lose everything for their chance to live. That's what made Muhammad Ali truly great, not his ability to win fights, but his willingness to lose one when losing meant more than winning ever could. The telegram that started it all, "The children of Vietnam need you to lose," was never seen by anyone except Ali and his closest advisors. But its message embodied something that both Bumpy Johnson and Muhammad Ali understood, that real champions don't just fight for themselves. They fight for everyone who can't fight back. And sometimes the greatest victory comes from accepting defeat.